So we've talked a lot about the ways in which we can provide templates for grief. And what we're going to move into next is how we actually help the people that we encounter cope with the feelings, balancing between moving above and out of and swimming down deep and into. And so we're going to talk about coping and feelings through this lens of the dual process model. And the dual process model is a model brought into grief work that really helps us to make sense of that undulation or the oscillation that we talked about previously. In this chapter, I'm going to help you integrate the dual process model into your work with clients in tangible ways. We're going to talk about questions you can ask, interventions you can use that brings that confusing process of movement and the waves into a structure that makes sense. We're going to talk about helping clients find their own balance, which will be different for each client. And you might also learn what it looks like for yourself too, to move through this. So in the dual process model, you can think of it as a dual-sided model, two different spaces. There's loss orientation on one side, and there's restoration orientation on the other. And when we use loss versus restoration orientation, what we're talking about is loss orientation looks at focusing on the loss, feeling feelings. This aligns really well with that second task of feeling the feelings in Warden's tasks. Over on the other side, the restoration orientation, this focuses on coping and regaining equilibrium. So this aligns really well with the third task. And as we talked initially about Warden's task, you might remember that I said we can move in and out of and work simultaneously on two tasks. The dual process model speaks beautifully to how we work in task 2 and task 3 together. And by working in task 2 and task 3, it inherently touches tasks 1 and 4 as well. And so with loss orientation, we'll use this side to indicate loss orientation. The focus is the loss, and it's the confrontation of the loss and really coming up against the loss having happened. And it focuses on the relationship between grief and symptoms, right? So the sadness, some of the physical impairments. It focuses on grief and interpersonal problems too. So how is this impacting relationships? This loss orientation over here is all the stuff that's happened as a result of the loss. This over here on this side, we gain more realistic understanding of the relationship with the deceased. When we're loss oriented or we're focusing over here, this is sometimes where the pain of realization comes in that perhaps the attachment was not exactly as we thought. We'll talk more about attachment in the coming chapters. One of the things to realize is that it's very common for us to idealize people once we've lost them. There's even colloquialisms in our culture of, don't speak ill of the dead. And it's interesting because nobody, goes to a memorial service or a funeral and speaks about the mistakes that someone made or speaks about maybe their kind of curmudgeon personality or these different things. We talk about all the highlights, right? And we talk about all the goodness. And when we engage in the loss orientation of the dual process model, it calls into question and really makes us reckon with the idea that not every attachment with every person was 100% positive. And acknowledging and recognizing that is part of moving through the loss orientation aspect of the dual process model. It also eventually helps us to sever the level of attachment to the deceased to a place that is appropriate. We have to look at the loss. We have to experience the pain in that orientation in order to move. Alternately, on the restoration side, we're restoration focused. We want to regain equilibrium. We want to get back to balance and okayness. It focuses on coping and functioning in the midst of grief. It focuses on, to put it simply, us finding our okayness again. And it focuses on reinvestment in work and other goals and roles. We could probably call the loss orientation side the feeling side, and the restoration orientation called the moving side. And moving and feeling are equally important here. Restoration side also can include avoidant or passive coping strategies. And as we move in this chapter here shortly, in talking about the ways we cope as humans, a little spoiler alert, avoidant coping strategies are not bad. We actually really encourage them, especially when our clients are oscillating over into restoration orientation. These are things like I still have to show up for, the class that I got accepted to, or the university I got accepted to, or the job I was offered. Or these life events are happening, I still have to show up in these various avenues. And so to fully feel feelings in that time or be in loss orientation doesn't allow us to move through life. And so avoidance strategies are actually encouraged when we're looking at the restoration orientation, because it helps us do the things we still have to do long after we adapt to the loss. And eventually the restoration orientation is what actually helps us to adapt to the loss, because that's where those concrete experiences of figuring out how we're going to fit this into us and into our life actually occur. So these are the two orientations. Again, loss or feelings, and restoration or coping. And then we'll talk about some specific stressors that are related to each. And as you think about when you're working with clients, listen for these stressors. And as they express them, it might help you to gauge where they are in their oscillation and to help them make that oscillation a more fluid movement. So some loss-oriented stressors, these are stressors that arise from focusing on and processing the actual loss of the person. They're stressors that arise as a result of the relationship with that person. So maybe some of that comes from the reckoning of what that attachment was really like, or what that relationship was really like. Some of the stressors, or I call them maybe the activators of this side, can be things like looking at old photos, that feeling of yearning or remembering the person, imagining what the loved one might say about something, reminiscing. A note about what the person might say. I had a client share with me once a pivotal learning experience in regards to grief. He shared with me that every time someone asks, well, what do you think your mother would say about this? He is pressured beyond belief, because he has to, one, remember who he doesn't have access to, and two, try to surmise or suppose or predict what this person he's no longer with would say to him in this new and novel experience. I think sometimes as practitioners, we think this will help. I'll bring the voice of their lost one into this moment. That's not always helpful, and I would caution you against using that as a reliable tool. Let your client first bring it in. Let the client say, I wish I knew what my mom would say about this. And you can say, I know she told you a lot of things. Is there something she already said you might want to call to question here? But I was so grateful to that client for sharing that with me, because it changed how I work. And I never would have thought that asking someone, well, what do you think they would say, can actually create an incredible amount of pressure to have to predict. And it stings. So allow that client to engage in that process on their own. Alternately, some restoration-oriented stressors. These are secondary sources of stress and coping. They're not emotionally directed at the loss. They're not emotionally directed at the death of the person. These are stressors like feelings of isolation or having to complete tasks on their own. We see this a lot with spousal loss, that some of those restoration-oriented stressors really are a result of, maybe my partner used to do this thing around the house, or maybe this partner was always in charge of this and I never actually learned how to do it on my own. Maybe it was I've never been on my own, right? And so they're not emotionally directed. They can even be financially directed. And I think sometimes in our effort to make our grief work human and empathic, we forget that there are tangible daily life stressors happening for the person that are outside of any emotion or love attached to the person that was lost. These stressors, like I said, can be financial or in what we call role strain. right? Now I'm the only person doing this thing when there used to be more of us or two of us. It's these logistic things that get impacted. So hopefully this gives a clear understanding of the dual process model and how it relates to coping. And so as we move a little further into that, I want to talk just a little more about that oscillation. You might be thinking, well, who can actually oscillate? Who can oscillate between these two sides? All of us, all of the time, everyone. And everyone needs to. And usually distress, suffering occurs when perhaps we're lopsided in our oscillation or spending too much time in one or the other. Assessment of area of impairment or distress is important. So asking here's how I ask this to clients. If you think about your grief in big picture, if you think about your grief as a big lump, what about it is most painful? And sometimes the person will say, well, that they're not here anymore, right? Or I miss them. And sometimes they'll say, I don't know how I'm going to pay the mortgage. And both of those are valid, right? And gives us a very clear understanding of where that person is. Once we determine whether their stressors are primarily emotional or primarily logistic, helps us to determine the way we need to intervene first, because we'll hit that direct type of stressor with our intervention. When we look at oscillation too, it's also important for us, just like in trauma work, to help our clients create a window of tolerance and language for both the clinician or the practitioner and the client to articulate that window of tolerance. Window of tolerance means how much distress can I feel without completely losing it and moving and maybe even dissociating out of this experience. But also, what's my bottom level of my window to know I'm actually in the work? And when we have language around window of tolerance and we say, how would you articulate to me that you are moving towards the top of your window of tolerance? And we ask our clients to actually practice telling us that in session. What we can then do is help them oscillate between each side, knowing that they can tell us when and how they need to move based on that window of tolerance language. We search for the processes at hand that explain and maintain the person's difficulty, and we create interventions specific to that. So if we notice they can't oscillate very well, it's difficult for them to, then our first task in that work, our first job is to help them learn to oscillate between the two. How they oscillate, how a person oscillates, has a lot to do with their attachment, their ability to create safety and to notice when they are safe. So if you check in with yourself for a moment, ask yourself as a practitioner, how do I know when I'm safe to feel feelings? Is it when I'm at work? Probably not. Is it when I'm driving? Maybe, maybe not, right? But how do I know where is safety and how I know I'm actually safe? What allows me to feel safe? Once we know some of those things for ourselves, that's when self-disclosure is really helpful for clients, right? When they're trying to find the language for what we're asking them, and we can say, for me, it looks like this. I don't like to cry at work, right? So I wait until this space where I feel safe. So teaching our clients to oscillate is really important. Then we look at coping. So coping is basically the behaviors we have in place to deal with stress. Simply put, stress is the feeling that occurs when a resource is being threatened, whether that's real or imagined. So when we feel stress, we try to cope with it. Very human genius of us, right? And we're getting pretty good at it, but there's 4 different domains that coping exists in. So if we think about coping, they can be approach strategies or active coping strategies or passive coping strategies. The difference in active and passive is that active directly attends to the stressor at hand. It directly tries to attend to the problem. So if the problem or stressor is in that restoration orientation, and it's, I don't know how I'll pay my mortgage, talking to the bank, looking at savings, those are approach strategies, right? Alternately, passive strategies are strategies that help us to feel better, but they won't necessarily eliminate the problem. You may be thinking, well, then we just need to do active strategies. Well, we can't always. We can't always have the bandwidth. We can't always have the emotional temperature to engage in an approach way. Passive and active are equally important, and we must find a balance between the two. So passive strategies might look like today is not my day. Today is too much. Today I'm too raw, I'm too tender. I'm calling off of work and I have to stay home and I need to sleep. Sleeping does not inherently make the stressor go away, but what it will do is get us back into a place mentally and emotionally to be able to actively cope. So we've got active and passive. Within each of those, then there's positive and negative, or what I like to say, adaptive or maladaptive, or helpful or unhelpful. And we have a grid for this that I show clients, and we'll often fill it out in session. One of the things it highlights is how well they actually cope and how good they are at finding what works for them. And so active negative or active unhelpful would be the thing that needs to happen to attend to the stressor, but in a way that is unhelpful. So maybe you need to have a conversation with your colleague who keeps asking you about your grief every day, and it's just activating you over and over. Maybe you need to have a conversation with them and to set those grief boundaries, but doing so by yelling, screaming, being mad is an unhelpful way to do it. So a lot of the times when we look at what makes something active and unhelpful is that the state in which we are is unhelpful to making it productive. On the other side, passive negative looks like complete and total avoidance. So instead of sleeping for that day, maybe we're not getting out of bed for a couple weeks. Or we know there's some things we need to engage in, or maybe some conversations we need to engage in, and instead we completely isolate. So we want to be staying obviously in the positive version or the helpful version of each, but with a balance between the two. The way that we know what we're capable of in that moment is by taking emotional temperature, or what I call resource inventory. Do I have what I need right now in order to do this approach active strategy? Or do I need to sit in passive for a bit until I can do that well? And teaching our clients to do that, normalizing it, will probably go against a lot of what they've ever learned about how to cope in this life effectively, but it's really, really important for them to understand. When we look at loss orientation versus restoration orientation, I want to share this overlap with you and how we as practitioners actually bring it into the office, the language we use, the questions we use to determine and actually be the motivators of change and movement in that oscillation. So if we're looking at loss orientation, we're asking exploratory questions. We're promoting depth. So we're asking those questions like, what does that feel like for you? What's hardest about that for you? Where do you feel that in your body? We're reflecting intense and heavy emotions. That sounds like sorrow, right? Here is emotion-focused questions. We're adding our meaning and interpretation frequently. And we're also asking about physiological responses that are connected with those emotions. Here too, over on this loss side, is where we're asking questions about reminiscing. One of the things that's really important is for us to ask clients as appropriate to tell us about the person they lost. I hear frequently that one of the most powerful things that happens in session, especially around grief work, is that we get to know the person that was lost. I had a client share with me once that by the end of our work, she felt like I knew her best friend nearly as well as she did. And one of the most healing aspects of that is that there was now another person in the world who understood how much that person meant, how wonderful they were, what they brought to this world. And it was completely sacred in our space. And so when we bear witness to the person's loss, we also are bearing witness to a person that they lost. And over in that space of loss orientation, that's therapeutic, right? In restoration orientation, on the other hand, these are cognitive questions. These are questions about thoughts and behaviors. We're assessing functioning. These might even be more yes and no questions, and they're behavioral and skills based. This is where our solution focused work comes in real handy, where some of those scaling questions are going to be really good. These are things that are observational too. I've told clients before, I noticed you look a little brighter today, right? or I noticed that you seem a little bit clearer today, right? And ask them to comment on that. This is where problem solving and stabilizing also comes into space. What exists in that then in between is the somatic experiences that are happening for a client, because they touch on both, the observed things that we see as a practitioner and calling those into the immediate, mindfulness, right? Being grounded and present in where they are and helping them to articulate between the two. Most importantly, what happens in between is containment, your window of tolerance, and grounding. Because as we move from oscillation, right, if sometimes a session quite literally will look like restoration orientation, how are you doing? Loss orientation, let's feel through the feelings and move in this process. And then back up through grounding, window of tolerance, and containment, back up to restoration orientation. So when you think about the power we have and the power we illuminate to clients to move themselves from loss or restoration, we can actually use that oscillation process in and of itself as an intervention. And if we then pull even further out in this macro view and we make that process overt to clients and say, do you realize how you oscillated today? Do you realize how beautifully we assessed functioning and then you went into the soulful depths of this grief work and then moved back out so that you can go to your work shift? They then observe themselves grounding. They then observe themselves regulating themselves. And we know what that does for things like self-efficacy. So as we conclude this chapter, I hope some of the things that are becoming clearer is that grief really is like coming up for air versus swimming down into the depths, right? The oscillation that occurs has a lot to do with swimming down and coming back up for air, swimming down and coming back up for air. We can neither fully feel nor fully avoid grief. We can't choose either in its entirety, right? It's like deciding to hold our breath forever. We can't do it. So it's in this undulation between feelings and managing that we actually find ourselves able to endure the pain and the suffering until it lifts. And it's where we start to flex our muscles in being able to move and adapt to grief and find ourselves strong enough to pick it up and put it in its place of adaptation.